Strange to think of food being discovered, but there must have been a first time that a human ever put a food in his mouth. It was a brave or desperate person who first saw an oyster and thought, "Yep, I want to gobble that." Sometimes the discovery of food was so long in the past that its origins have become legendary. Sometimes, though, we know exactly when and how a food was found. Here are 8 of the origin stories of common foods and drinks. Number 8. Tea. Tea is one of the most popular drinks in the world. Its caffeine content is relatively mild, so it once both stimulating and calming without giving you the jitters. How did the leaves of the tea plant come to be so highly prized? In one Chinese legend, the properties of tea were discovered by the Emperor of China. It was in 2737 BC that the Emperor Shen Nong found himself sitting under a tree. He happened to be boiling some water when a gust of wind wafted some leaves down into the bubbling pot. As they diffused in the water, the delicate smell of tea filled the air. Shen Nong drank the first cup of tea on record. It was lucky there wasn't a bird sitting in the tree, or well, we might be drinking droppings today. It seems more likely that tea was discovered as having medicinal properties at some point and incorporated in the Chinese medicine before evolving into the modern drink. The Chinese legend is not the only story of its origin. In one Indian story, a Buddhist known as Bodhidharma vowed to meditate for 10 years without sleeping. When he fell asleep after 9 years, he was so angry he tore off his eyelids. When they struck the ground, they transformed into tea plants, and tea became one way for monks to stave off sleep. Number 7. Coffee. Given that caffeine is highly addictive, it's understandable that tea and coffee have become staples in our daily lives. Coffee's true origin is lost in the mist of time, but the legends of how it was first discovered are pretty stimulating. In one tale from Ethiopia, it was a goat herd called Kaldi who first noticed the unique properties of coffee beans. He happened to be out with his goats when he noticed them eating berries from a certain plant, and then getting frisky and leaping about. The goats also did not sleep that night. When he told local monks about his discovery, they found that coffee helped them stay up to perform their prayers late at night. In an Islamic story, it was an exile from Mecca who found himself starving in the desert. When he chewed on berries from the coffee tree, his hunger went away, but they were too bitter. So he roasted the beans, but they became too hard. Next, he boiled them to soften them, but instead found the water converted into a delicious brew. Coffee, the drink, was born. Number 6. Popsicles. The popsicle is one of the most basic pleasures of a really hot summer. It seems like a no-brainer of an idea. Take some colorful and delicious juice, shove a stick in it, and freeze. Surely, they have existed since the dawn of time. In fact, we know the exact moment they were first created. It was in 1905 when a young boy called Frank Epperson decided to make some soda by mixing powdered drink and water with a wooden stick. He got distracted, however, and left his glass of unfinished drink in the back garden. When he returned the next morning, the drink had frozen solid, and the stirrer gave it a handy handle. Epperson named his invention the Epsicle, and even gained a patent on his invention that was a frozen confection of attractive appearance, which can be conveniently consumed without contamination by contact with the hand and without the need for a plate, spoon, fork, or other implement. The name Epsicle didn't win many fans, however, so it was rechristened as the Popsicle. When it failed to make Epperson much money, he sold the idea to a company who added a second stick, making the snappable frozen treat we know today. Number 5. Sweeteners. Sugar has been vilified recently as perhaps the worst food that anyone can eat. Before sugar was demonized, it was sugar replacing sweeteners that were thought to be pure evil. Today, most sweeteners have been thoroughly tested by scientists and found to be safe, but it was a lack of lab safety that led to the creation of some sweeteners. Aspartame was discovered when a scientist called James M. Schlatter was working on an anti-ulcer drug in his lab. Needing to turn a page on a book he was reading, he licked his finger. This is generally not encouraged in most modern labs, but Schlatter noticed that his finger was incredibly sweet. Cyclamate is a now banned sweetener that first emerged in 1937 when Michael Chiavetta stopped his work on a fever drug to have a smoke in his lab, which is apparently something you could do in the 30s. Chiavetta found his cigarette was sweet and realized he may have discovered an artificial sweetener. Number 4. Maple syrup. Generally, we only think of trees as a source of food when we're thinking about their fruit. Maple syrup, however, is the product of humans essentially stabbing a tree and drinking its blood. How did humans figure out that maple trees have sweet juice inside them? It's well known that the indigenous people in North America were producing maple syrup long before European settlers arrived. Maple syrup does not come out of the tree in the form we pour onto our pancakes. The syrup starts as a watery fluid and must be boiled into a thick syrup. Indigenous people did not boil maple syrup, though. They would leave maple sap out in a shallow vessel, and when the water froze, the syrup would be left behind. According to one legend, Prince Glasup found that these people were slacking off their work because they were drinking syrup straight from a tree. To stop this happening again, he added water to the trees and made the sweet fluid only rise up in the trees in spring. Some tribes name Nambuza as the god who stopped maple syrup forming in its pure form in trees. A more realistic origin for maple syrup comes from the tale of Mokwa. When she was cooking some mousse for her husband, she ran out of water. Unable to locate any, she used the sap from a maple tree. During the cooking, it boiled down into a syrup that apparently goes really well with moose meat. Number 3, the sandwich. Sandwiches are one of the most popular ways of eating lunch. For hundreds of thousands of years, bread has been a staple of many people's diets. Most people have got the majority of their calories from bread. A lunch would have had a loaf of bread and some other things to give it a bit of flavor. We can't know who the first person was to cut their bread and put their meat between the slices, but we do know who popularized it. John Montagu, 4th Earl of Sandwich, lived in the 18th century in a Britain that was heavily addicted to gambling. The aristocracy would spend their time at the gambling tables winning, or more often, losing fortunes. For some, like the Earl of Sandwich, even a moment away from the table was a moment lost. So instead of taking a break to eat meat, he ordered the cook to bring him something he could eat without getting up. This turned out to be slices of bread with flavorful fillings between them. The bread stopped his hands getting greasy. You didn't need a knife and fork. Gambling could continue. Whether this was the true origin of the sandwich is debated, but the Earl is perhaps the most lasting contribution. Number 2, tofu. Tofu is a rather bland ingredient with quite the colorful origin. It has a long history that dates back at least 2,000 years. At some point, soy milk was mixed with something to make it coagulate into something resembling cheese. How this step was first made is a controversial subject. The most basic theory is that impure sea salt was added to soy milk to flavor it. There was seaweed or magnesium salts in the mix. It would make the soy milk curdle. This is entirely possible, but not as interesting as the other legend of its origin. According to one tale, it was a Chinese prince of the Han Dynasty called Liu, who was first called tofu. Liu An was a great scholar and seemed to have had a fondness for soybeans. One legend had him inventing soy milk for his grandmother when she found the beans too difficult to chew. Apparently, it was while Liu An was researching immortality and alchemy that he came up with the recipe for tofu. While most people would be happy to have invented a meat substitute, Liu An has said it actually came up with a recipe for immortality. One account saw Liu An growing younger from eating tofu. He then sprouted wings and ascended to the heavens to live forever. That's one way of encouraging people to eat tofu. Number 1, cornflakes. If you believe everything you read online, then you no doubt already know that Kellogg's cornflakes were invented as part of a crusade against the evils of masturbation. Like most facts that appear on the internet, things are a lot more complex and weirder than they seem. It is true that Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, inventor of the cornflake, was a doctor, nutritionist, and religious man with some strange ideas. In his books, he revealed that masturbation was the cause of a variety of illnesses, from epilepsy to fickleness to bad posture. One of his cures for these problems was bland food, and plenty of it. Other cures were inserting silver wires into the foreskin and dabbing the clitoris with carbolic acid. Cornflakes could have been part of this anti-masturbation campaign, but they were never marketed as such. The real story behind the creation of cornflakes is just as interesting without focusing on self-abuse, however. The Kellogg brothers ran a sanatorium at Battle Creek. While they were searching for an easy-to-digest food for the patients, they cooked some corn. When they got distracted, the cooked corn was left out overnight and turned stale. Being thrifty as well as health conscious, the pair decided to cook the corn anyway by pressing them into thick biscuits. This didn't work, but it created thin flakes that the brothers loved, the lack of taste of. The flavorless cereal proved a hit, though no data has been released on cornflakes' effect on masturbation.